So, good morning, or actually good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the program. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the George C. Marshall Foundation and the Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity. Now, before I turn the program over to Russ Fletcher, Chairman of the Board of the George C. Marshall Foundation, I encourage you to ask your questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A in the bottom of your screen. We'll have time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Mr. Fletcher, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the George C. Marshall Foundation, located in Lexington, Virginia. Mr. Fletcher?
Jamie, thank you for inviting the Marshall Foundation to present today. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be a part of this distinguished panel. Bill, if you're there, I'm very pleased to meet you. Your father rests in my pantheon of Cold War heroes and as a patriot for his distinguished service to the nation, which includes, of course, his leadership role in founding the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. Melissa, it's very nice to see you again. COVID has kept me away from the Marshall Library for much of the past year. However, I want to thank you and team for your extraordinary service in keeping things going in Lexington during these very trying times. You and team are to be highly commended in how you've dealt with the attendant challenges. Thank you. Before getting into specifics about the Marshall Foundation, I should preface my remarks by briefly recounting the extraordinary career of George Catlett Marshall. And I'll do so by drawing on historian Mark Stoler's wonderful biography, which I think is still the best short biography that so far has been written. During the first half of the 20th century, the United States emerged as the most powerful and influential nation in the world. George Marshall's career paralleled this rise to power, from the Philippine insurrection that followed America's first colonial venture at the turn of the century, through two world wars, the Cold War, and the Korean conflict. Marshall was a participant over a 50-year period in almost every major event and issue that marked the United States emergence as a superpower. Between 1939 and 1951, Marshall was also a key formulator of US policies, serving as World War II Army Chief of Staff from 1939 to 45, Special Presidential Emissary to China, 1945 to 47, Secretary of State during the height of the Cold War, 1947 to 1949, and Secretary of Defense during the Korean War, 1950 to 51. He was thus one of the creators not only of America's awesome military power, but also of its major foreign policies and global strategies in the contemporary world. Statesman as well as soldier, his character and accomplishments were so exceptional that he is placed in the company only of George Washington when historical parallels and superlatives are used. Marshall's character casts a giant historical shadow. As Stoler says, his leadership qualities, self-control, sense of honor and duty, and apparent lack of personal ambition were so extraordinary that virtually every individual with whom he worked, from President Truman on down, felt duty-bound to recount and comment on them in hushed tones of veneration. As with George Washington, the result was the creation of an historical monument and legend, although often accurate as to personal characteristics, just as often masked rather than revealed the subject's key beliefs and historical contributions. President Truman thought that George Marshall, more than any other man, had been responsible for winning the Second World War. He said, quote, "He takes his place at the head of the great commanders in history." And of course, Truman knew his history. And he later said there wasn't a decoration big enough for General Marshall, and often referred to him reverentially as the Great One. As it turns out, it is President Truman who, by his selfless actions, which I'll describe in a moment, provides the initial impetus in making the Marshall Foundation a reality, and thereby paves the way for its future support. After the end of the Second World War, as various wartime leaders began publishing their memoirs, there was growing pressure on General Marshall to write his recollections of his civilian and military service. In fact, there was rumor that he had been offered as much as $1 million to do so. He rejected all such proposals. The core of these efforts was spearheaded by a group of graduates of the Virginia Military Institute, Marshall's alma mater. President Truman, well informed of the efforts of the high-minded VMI graduates, many of whom had worked personally with White House staff, including General Frank McCarthy, later the producer of the movie Patton, was highly interested in helping preserve Marshall's legacy for the nation, and thus fully supported the efforts of the VMI group. On January 17, 1953, 3 days before Eisenhower is sworn in as president, Truman released a memorandum directing the Departments of State and Defense and the National Archives to cooperate with VMI and the soon-to-be-formed Marshall Foundation in procuring documentary material relating to the activities of General Marshall in his various public roles. It also requested that the Archivist of the United States provide to the Foundation reproductions of official records relating to Marshall's career. Within a week of President Truman's directive, the Board of Visitors of VMI moved to organize the nonprofit George C. Marshall Research Foundation, the stated purpose of which was to collect and receive papers and records relating to the life and public service of General Marshall. To assist in effectuating this, the General Assembly of Virginia had enacted legislation authorizing VMI to deed land to the foundation as a site for a library and museum to be open to the public. The foundation funding for the project was to be raised from private sources. So there you have it. Harry Truman, whose great hero in life, George Marshall, a man too self-deprecating to write a memoir, pays him the ultimate tribute of ensuring that his legacy, his impeccable record of service to the nation, is preserved for posterity. It is my opinion that the Marshall Foundation would never have become a reality without President Truman's actions. Thus, I consider President Truman the true father of the foundation. Incidentally, one very interesting thing that President Truman inserted at the end of his January 17th memorandum is this, and I quote, "I am requesting each of you," meaning his department secretaries, "to bring this memorandum to the attention of your successors in office as a matter of urgency. I feel confident that they will wish to support the efforts that have been commenced to provide suitable recognition to one of the greatest Americans of our age." So Truman here indirectly reaches out to Eisenhower and successors, imploring them to carry forward the torch he has led. And as they say, the rest is history. Eisenhower enthusiastically supports the foundation project. President Kennedy, who, like President Truman, is a student of history, he adores the idea and supports it as well. President Johnson also shows his support by playing the key role at the dedication of the museum and library on May 24th, 1964. Financial support of the Foundation in its early years was led by John D. Rockefeller Jr. He provided over 25% of the capital funds for the building. Subsequently, his sons David and Nelson gave generously through the years. Interestingly, 10% of foundation donors have been VMI alums, but VMI alums account for about 25% of total funds raised. And there is a cadre of very enthusiastic VMI donors to whom we are most grateful. Leadership of the foundation in its early years was dominated by General Omar Bradley and Secretary Robert Levitt. These distinguished gentlemen served as head of the foundation for more than a quarter of a century. Subsequent chairmen taking us into the 21st century included General Andrew Goodpaster and Senator Nancy Kassebaum Baker. The foundation board has been blessed throughout its history with highly dedicated trustees. The list of trustee names is literally a who's who of 20th century leaders in American government, education, and business. All have firmly believed in and sought to perpetuate and promote the Marshallian legacy of selfless service to country. That concludes my remarks. It's a great pleasure for me now to introduce Bill Nitze.
Well, at this point, hi, we're so happy to have Bill. At this point, I think we wanted to share a quick video before we introduce Bill, which is okay. I wanted to share that with the audience. So if you'll bear with me, and we see Bill. Bill, we're so happy to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you.
So yes, I just want to share this video real quickly with our audience. So if to our speakers, if you wouldn't mind just turning off your cameras and muting yourselves so we don't interfere with the audio, that would be lovely. And then once we come back on, we will return to you and continue with our program. So everyone just bear with me for a minute, if you don't mind.
A little way. Explain that a little bit more fully. But I did attempt to draw him out so far as I was able.
Ambassador Nitze, when the Marshall Plan was announced with General Marshall's name on it, was that something he was in favor of, his name being attached to this plan, when in actuality, had he not delegated the responsibility to a policy planning committee that you were part of, and then listened and read that report, and then carried through some of the research and thinking that other people had actually done?
No, that isn't my recollection. My recollection is that when he delivered that speech, he went over it very carefully. The draft was really prepared, the essential parts of the speech were prepared by Chip Bolin, who was concentrated on Soviet Union and Soviet affairs. And Chip did a superb job of drafting those. So there were only 5 paragraphs in that speech that bore upon the real situation. But having delivered that speech, then he left it to others to really convert those 5 paragraphs of ideas into a plan. There wasn't any plan at the time that he delivered the speech. But he backed those of us who did work up the plan. He backed us to the full. He didn't try to tell us exactly what to do, but he backed us, encouraged us, delegated to us, supervised us. But he was a superb leader in that.
It seems that those leadership qualities really did set him apart. The fact that he wanted to decentralize the authority, but he didn't get too far from it, did he? I mean, he kept a close eye on
he kept a close eye, but he really did encourage those who were working for him to take the initiative. He didn't want to tell them what to do. He said, this is your responsibility. You then go ahead and do it. You understand it in detail. You've got to work this thing out. You've got to complete your staff work. And you've got to really work these things out. And you can't come up with a half-baked solution to it. You've really got to be sure that the thing is thought through, that all the alternatives have been considered, that you know what the hell you're doing.
it seemed that he was faced with certain challenges. One of them was, or on several occasions, he had to rebuild and mobilize an army and take a nation that was completely unprepared into a state of preparedness. And I'm wondering, did you see evidence of that? Once again, over and over again, finding a nation that had let the army go, let the numbers get very low, and then suddenly bring it back at the last minute to meet some crisis.
Well, of course, that was his overriding responsibility when he became chief of staff, and particularly after the shock of Pearl Harbor, to get a fighting force mobilized and to get the American people behind it. And the speeches he made and the tactful way he went about cultivating people in Congress and just the image that he projected went a long way to getting the American people, I think, to understand the seriousness of what was coming up. And when the selective service renewal came up in Congress, you know, it was passed by only one vote, and I don't think it would have been passed then if General Marshall hadn't been there and made a very persuasive, low-key but very convincing speech. It was passed by only one vote, and I don't think it would have been passed then if General Marshall hadn't been there and made a very persuasive, low-key but very convincing speech.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that piece of history. So I will now turn the program over to, or back to Russ, who will introduce our special guest, Mr. William Nitze. So Russ, I will turn the program back to you. Thank you for indulging us with that short video.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me now to introduce Bill Nitze. Bill, nice to see you. As background, Bill is chairman of Oceana Energy Company and of ClearPath Technologies, Inc. He is also the co-founder of GridPoint, Inc. He serves on the advisory board of the Krasnow Institute for Advanced Study at George Mason University and as president of the Committee for the Republic. He's an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and is chairman of the board of advisors of the European Institute. Bill is a graduate of Harvard College, Wadham College, Oxford, and the Harvard Law School. Bill, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much. General Marshall, of course, was not only a great man in my father's eyes, he's been one of my heroes since I first learned anything about American history. And what you saw in that video clip was my father reflecting on General Marshall's qualities of leadership. And his greatest quality of leadership was to be an inspiration to all who worked for him and with him because of his character. And secondly, he expected them to be leaders in their own right. And not only was prepared to delegate, but insisted on delegating. In other words, he insisted that everybody who worked for and with him rose to the mark and did their part. All I can say is that's what we desperately need today. We need people who will inspire by force of character and bring out the best in others by delegating, but delegating with responsibility and accountability. I hope that we are moving in that direction. I hope the country's young people have taken that message on board, but we certainly have much work to do. Why don't I leave it at that for the moment? Oh, I will add this. Since Johns Hopkins and SAIS is sponsoring this event, the creation of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins was
in my father's eyes, perhaps his greatest achievement, because what it did is to take that basic idea of developing leadership in others into the context of a school that would teach the young leaders of the future foreign affairs and the history underlying foreign affairs, and thereby cultivate precisely the qualities that General Marshall stood for. And furthermore, that school would take students from all over the world and help form an international network of young leaders who hopefully would be able to follow General Marshall's example in their own way. And I give Christian Herter full recognition as being part of that great enterprise. He was a great man in his own right. He was a great governor, a great member of our legislature, and performed yeoman service as the country's Secretary of State.
Bill, thank you very much for that, and ditto your comments about your father and about Christian Herter. As a graduate of SAIS, I tell people when I was there, I always felt like a kid in a candy store. The courses were fabulous, as were the professors. And so your father and Christian Herter are to be greatly and forever commended for that, founding that enterprise. Switching gears, I'd like to now introduce Melissa Davis. Melissa is Director of Library and Archives at the George C. Marshall Foundation. Before coming to us at the foundation in 2019, she was an academic librarian specializing in history at Southern Virginia University for 10 years. Melissa graduated with a bachelor's degree in library and information technology from the University of Maine at Augusta, and she received her Master of Library Science degree from Clarion University of Pennsylvania. Melissa enjoys working with researchers from the middle school level through the graduate level, as well with professional researchers. At the Marshall Library, she has the good fortune of being surrounded by almost 4,000 undergraduate students, all within about a half-mile radius of the front steps of the library. Thus, her big challenge is to get more and more of them using primary source materials, particularly those of the global archive that we have at Marshall, which indeed is a rich and rare resource for an undergraduate to have access. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Russ, very much. I appreciate it. And it was lovely to finally get to meet Bill Nitze and to be part of this today. I'd like to welcome you to the George C. Marshall Foundation Library and the Robert A. Levitt Reading Room. In addition to the library, there's a 3-story archive of several hundred collections containing documents, photos, maps, films, posters, and oral histories from military and government luminaries of the first half of the 20th century, to include George C. Marshall's papers from his military and civilian career as Army Chief of Staff, Special Representative of the U.S. President to China, Secretary of State, President of the American Red Cross, and Secretary of Defense, and collections from William and Elizabeth Smith Friedman, James A. Van Fleet, Frank McCarthy, C. Tyler Wood, Andrew Goodpaster, Marshall Carter, Lucian Truscott Jr., and many others. Using documents and photographs from the archives and the words of those involved, I'd like to spend the next few minutes showing how the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers, the Marshall Plan, and the Nobel Prize are connected. Let's begin with George Marshall, who became Secretary of State in January 1947 on his return from serving the previous year as the special representative for the US president in China. His first international conference was at the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers, held March 10th through April 24th, 1947, and which didn't end with the agreement settling the post-war European questions the Americans attending had hoped for. In an April 28, 1947 radio broadcast, Secretary Marshall reported on the outcome of the conference in a most diplomatic manner. Quote, "This conference dealt with the vital center of Europe, Germany and Austria. In the Moscow negotiations, all the disagreements came into sharp focus and remained, in effect, unsolved. These issues are matters of vast importance to the lives of the people of Europe and to the future course of world history. We must not compromise on great principles in order to achieve agreement for agreement's sake. We cannot ignore the factor of time involved here. The recovery of Europe has been far slower than had been expected. Disintegrating forces are becoming evident. The patient is sinking while the doctors deliberate." Close quote. These are Marshall's handwritten notes for this broadcast speech. He frequently wrote his own speeches, and he frequently rewrote the speeches others crafted for him. This is a protest in post-war Germany. It is not for jobs or about housing, but simply for food. After the conference, George Kennan, who had attended, took a longer view in his speech, Problems of U.S. Foreign Policy After Moscow, given May 6, 1947. He said, quote, "The Soviet leaders do expect to meet us again in negotiation on these questions, and they expect that when that time comes, they will be in a better bargaining position and we in a worse one than today. In other words, their analysis of the situation has led them to conclude that they stand to gain and we stand to lose by a further delay in the negotiation of a European settlement. That realization alone could explain the attitude they adopted at Moscow. The second factor, which looms large in Soviet strategy, is the strong probability, as they see it, that we will not be able to muster, as a nation, the leadership, the imagination, the political skill, the material resources, and above all, the national self-discipline necessary to bring material stability, confidence, and hope for the future to those areas of Western Europe which have been brought low by war," close quote. Paul Nitze recounted later that when Marshall returned from Moscow, he, quote, "came back feeling deeply that he had been sent off with inadequate instructions. He was used to having completed staff work before anything was done. He made his people really work through all the alternatives and recommend which alternative should be followed and why and how it was to be implemented," close quote. When he got home, Marshall pulled George Kennan from the National War College, where he was working, to organize and head the new policy planning staff, which would examine short and long-term problems, possible solutions, and intended and sometimes unintended consequences, and make recommendations directly to the Secretary of State. Marshall wanted the group organized immediately. He told Kennan, "I don't want to wait," and he advised the group to, quote, "avoid trivia," close quote. In the beginning, the policy planning staff was very small. Besides Kennan, a few early members included Dorothy Fosdick, Charles Burt Marshall, and Paul Nitze. The staff did not wait to get started. A short 18 days after being organized, the policy planning staff delivered their first recommendations to Secretary Marshall on aid to Western Europe. On the first page, Kennan wrote, quote, "Normally, I would consider this far too short a time in which to consider and make recommendations on matters of such importance, but I recognize that the need for a program of action on this problem is urgent, And the best answer we can give today is perhaps more useful than a more thoroughly considered study 1 or 2 months hence, close quote. Secretary Marshall was invited to speak after being awarded an honorary degree on June 5th, 1947 at Harvard. He chose this occasion to unveil the policy recommended by the planning staff. This is the reading copy of Marshall's speech, and in person, if you get to see it, you'd see that there is a vertical fold where he carried it folded in his suit pocket. And he wrote on here that he delivered it at 2:50 p.m. on June 5th. In an interview, Paul Nitze said of Chip Bolin, who is shown here, that he was the one who was given the task of drafting this speech that Secretary Marshall was to give at Harvard. The guts of the speech are really in 5 paragraphs, but the ideas were profound. And one of the central ideas was that it was directed against the threat of starvation, of economic disaster. It was offered to all who were in trouble in Europe, including the Soviet Union and what became the Warsaw Pact countries. It was open to them, provided they were all prepared to work together in order to do the things that were necessary to ease the common recovery of Europe as a whole. Quote by Mr. Nitze, so the speech turned out to be a tremendous success, I think somewhat to General Marshall's surprise. But the next problem was that it was a concept. It wasn't a plan. We had just those 5 paragraphs, close quote. Because George Marshall was Secretary of State, any speech he made was accompanied by a press release. Normally, important press releases were double-spaced for ease of reading and quoting by newspapers and radio. This one was single-spaced. Marshall asked that no press be especially invited to hear his speech. He did, however, ask for Dean Acheson to contact British press to be aware of the speech, and he arranged for them to have copies as soon as their American counterparts did. Marshall wanted the first reaction to the speech to come from Great Britain, since the plan was intended to be a European plan funded by the United States. During the summer of 1947, the 16 European nations who composed the Committee of European Cooperation organized the European Recovery Plan, also known as the Marshall Plan. They were guided by US expectations, which included making the plan available to all European countries, setting a specific time frame, and requiring free trade among the participating countries. It was now Secretary Marshall's job to convince the American people this plan was a good idea and to convince Congress to fund it. This was not going to be easy, as the United States had spent an estimated $4 trillion on World War II. Getting Congress to fund the European Recovery Act required Marshall to appear before the Appropriations and other committees many times over the next few months. And here he's shown testifying before the Senate Appropriations Committee, and sitting next to him is Robert Levitt. This book, which is here at the museum, is a compilation of all the congressional legislation necessary to pass the European Recovery Act. The book is nearly 6 inches thick. President Truman signed the European Recovery Act on April 3rd, 1948, a mere 10 months after Marshall gave his Harvard speech. And for a major international program that required cooperation from so many parties, this is really an amazing fact. Over the next 4 years, 16 countries in Europe participated in the $13 million Marshall Plan. Some of the money was provided in grants, some in loans that would need to be repaid. The money was spent on rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure of roads and railroads, factories, housing. It brought the technology of tractors and automated equipment to farmers, as well as seed. It generated electricity and restored natural gas services to the area. In 1953, George Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was nominated for the Marshall Plan as a grand peacekeeping factor. In his acceptance speech, Marshall said, quote, "There has been considerable comment over the awarding of a Nobel Peace Prize to a soldier. This does not seem as remarkable to me as it quite evidently appears to others. I know a great deal of the horrors and tragedies of war. I am deeply moved to find some means or method of avoiding another calamity of war." This is the Nobel Peace Prize medallion that was awarded to General Marshall. It is on display here at the George C. Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia. If you decide later that you have questions or you would like to schedule a research appointment or simply like to come and visit and see some of the many interesting things that we have here in the archives and library, here is my contact information. I hope that you enjoyed this few minutes together and that you learned something, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. This was really wonderful. And we do have a few questions. Hopefully, you will be able to answer them. If not, we can always take them back and try and get answers to the lovely attendees who have asked them. So one question is, can you speak to Marshall's position and involvement in the crisis with MacArthur in Korea?
I can speak a little bit to that. There has been criticism after the fact, hindsight is 2020, that Marshall should have acted sooner to relieve MacArthur, and that she should have made it very plain that MacArthur should not have passed a certain designated parallel advancing into Korea, because past that, the supply train would become difficult to maintain. So there are people who say that Marshall was not forceful enough with MacArthur. I think that Marshall's leadership style, though, was to choose good leaders, to let them know what he expected of them, and then to get out of their way and let them lead, that he was available to them if they had questions or needed assistance, but he did not ordinarily offer unsolicited advice. He trusted his leaders, and when they weren't doing what they were supposed to, he would relieve them. So the question then is debatable. Should he have done it sooner or later? And I don't think there's a really good answer to that.
Thanks. I have another question. If you can, please compare and contrast General Marshall's impact with Admiral Leahy, who also had a large influence on the conduct of World War II.
The construction, organization of the Joint Chiefs at the beginning of World War II was to make the communication between the departments in the War Department, the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Army, which of course at that time included the Air Corps, to make the communication much better. The idea is that they would meet together at least once a week for lunch, to talk things over, and that the camaraderie they would develop would enable there to be less competition and more cooperation in conduct of this massive, literally global war. Our Antarctica is the only continent that didn't have fighting on it. And so in organizing this, General Marshall could see, number one, that Roosevelt was a Navy man, and that to keep anyone from saying that the Army was shoving this whole idea of a Joint Chiefs down the Navy's throat, that Marshall indicated and supported the choice of Admiral Leahy as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And they worked very well together. Marshall, Leahy, King, and Hap Arnold are the ones who would get together at least once a week. And while they didn't always agree with each other, there was some discussion and differentiation on the amount of money put into airplanes versus ships. They did work well together, and I think the organization has, in the interim, proved to be a viable and a wise choice for allowing the departments to work together.
Thank you. Gosh, you are a wealth of information, Melissa. It's very impressive. We have another question. So Marshall was opposed to President Truman's recognition of Israel. Did he at any future time regret this stand?
He was not per se opposed to President Truman's recognition of Israel. He was worried about the timing. He was afraid that it was being rushed. And as we have discussed today, he was a person who wanted the staff work done before the action was taken. And he didn't feel at the time that the staff work, the indications of possible future consequences have been taken fully into account. And so he was certainly in favor of it, but the timing was what he was not happy with.
Thank you for the clarification. I don't at this time see any more questions. You certainly have shared an amazing amount of information with us. So at this point, I would like to thank you and Mr. Fletcher, and of course, Bill Nitze. What a treat to have him speak. Thank you all for your time and talent. We'll send a follow-up email. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, we do have a few more questions if you don't mind. So can you comment upon Marshall's choice of Eisenhower, sorry about that, to lead in Europe as their abilities seem similar?
When it came time to choose the Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe, of course, Marshall wanted that job. And Marshall was a modest man and he was a private man, but he was not without drive. And he had conducted this global campaign up to this point, and he certainly had a desire to lead the troops. However, he went to President Roosevelt and he's told him that he would support whatever president desired. Once again, he subsumed his desire to what was best and what President Roosevelt was most comfortable with. And President Roosevelt told him that he would not be comfortable having Marshall leave Washington. And so Marshall very graciously acquiesced and supported General Eisenhower in the job. In fact, when the notation was made at the conference in Cairo that General Eisenhower would become the Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion, General Marshall took the paper and he wrote a handwritten note on the bottom of it to Ike. I thought you'd like to have this to keep for your records. You have my support, and he signed his initials. So he was very much in support of General Eisenhower being the Supreme Allied Commander.
Well, again, this is super fascinating, and you've done an amazing job, and your slide presentation was wonderful, I have to say. So, at this point, I do think we are done with our questions. And again, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the George C. Marshall Foundation and Mr. Fletcher, and of course, Bill Nitze for joining us today. We will send a follow-up email after the program. Mr. Fletcher, would you like to say any closing remarks?
Simply to say thank you, and continued success at SAIS, one of my favorite schools. So good luck. Thanks.
Mine too. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a happy, healthy rest of your week and year. And hopefully you'll join us again at a future program. I'll share information about future programs with you in my follow-up email. So with that, thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.